and welcome to another episode of Professional Book Girl. My name is Kayla, and I read a ton of books so that I can recommend the best to you. And it is almost time for book club. This is not the book club episode because it's a Monday. Our book club, though, is this week. It drops on Thursday, March 28th. Our book club pick for the month was Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. This is your last call, final reminder. If you would like to have your thoughts in that episode, please submit them to me immediately by March 26th, though. I am recording the episode on March 26th, so please get them to me then. You can type out your thoughts and DM it to me at kreadwhat, or send me a voice memo and email it to professionalbookgirlpod@gmail.com. If you're new to this podcast and just heard that, you might be confused, but we have a book club where we all read the same book every month, and at the end of the month, I create a spoiler-filled episode kind of going through all of my thoughts as I talk through the plot of the book and everything that happens, and it's really fun. I can't believe we're almost having our third book club. Time is just flying by. I already chose the April book club. I am very excited. So make sure you tune into the March book club episode later this week, because I will be announcing the April book club pick at the end of that episode. But it is the normal PBG Monday episode. So this is our monthly listener's choice segment where once a month I put on my Instagram, hey, tell me what books you want to hear me review. If I've read it, I will review it. And that is just the story of my life, basically. I also take requests for the opening segment of the show. So if you don't like what you hear, what you're going to hear reviewed on this episode, it's not my fault. This is what the people wanted, and I am just here to deliver. I'm very excited. I was really excited as the requests came through. People do sometimes send requests for books that I haven't read, but it helps me keep in mind, like someone this month requested Kingdom of the Wicked, which I have not read it yet, but I own it and I'm planning on reading it hopefully soon. So now I know, like in the next listener's choice, maybe I will do that book. Anyway, though, our opening segment, what I am obsessed with, this was requested, but it is something I'm obsessed with, which if you follow me on Instagram or if you listen to this podcast, you know I am obsessed with the TV show Masters of the Air. This came through. Someone requested that I talk about the show I'm obsessed with. I'm assuming it was this one because this is my number one show obsession lately. And I thought it would be fun to it was a limited series on Apple TV, 9 episodes. It ended last week, which is very sad, but I thought it would be fun to kind of review the limited series in the way that I do a book review. So you're hearing like a full review for a 5-star TV show. So I first want to talk about how I watch TV, which I have been I spent the beginning of March watching more TV than I typically would. Like I always had a few series going, which is not how I usually operate. Like usually I am just watching my weekly Bravo shows. So that means like right now I'm in a bit of a slow period. I only have shows on, I say slow period, but I have shows on Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, but there are times of the year where there is a Bravo show on every single night, but that's really only 1 to 2 hours of watching something a day. Then I always have a show that I'm running in the background while I'm working. So right now that show is Gossip Girl. I'm rewatching it for the first time. I only ever watched it as it initially aired. And then I will every now and then get in the mood to watch a series. So I lately though I was watching Traders was on and I was obsessed with it. And then I was watching Masters of the Air, obviously, Love on the Spectrum. I think that was it, but it just felt like I had a lot of shows to choose between, which is nice, but I sometimes get a little overwhelmed with like, I want to be spending my time reading, but am I going to start a show? Like today, for example, I was like, I have a few shows on my list that are next up. Like I'm going to start the Christian Dior show, The New Look on Apple TV, which so many people have messaged me and have been like, are you watching it? And like, I am going to watch it. I also want to watch The Gentleman, which is new on Netflix. And I was about to sit and start watching a show today, but I was like, I just don't feel like getting sucked into it because I'm in a really great reading mood right now, which I wasn't really in for a bit. So I'm like, I'd rather just spend this time reading than watching a show. So that's how like I usually operate. Like I usually don't spend, people will say to me all the time, like, how do you read so much? I'm like, well, if you think about how many hours a day, like most people watch TV, I dedicate that to reading instead. Anyway, all that to say, I was obsessed with the show. It aired weekly. I typically like to wait. This is why I haven't started the new look yet. I like to wait so I can binge it. So that way I'm kind of just dedicating like smaller pockets of time to shows. But I watched this one for the most part weekly. They did that thing where they released the first two and I was so hooked. And then I knew that I wasn't going to want to wait weeks between each episode. So I would kind of let a few build up and then catch up and then do that on and off again. So I finished it a bit late, but I loved this show so much. So this is basically historical fiction. It is a fictionalized version of a real life story. All of the men in this show are real. All of the events that happen are real, and it's about a World War II like air squadron. Obviously, I'm probably using the wrong term. The cast is stacked, and I kept joking like, "Oh, I'm watching this for the hot guys," but like Austin Butler, Callum Turner, Barry Koenig, Anthony Boyle, who's like the new Hawkeye on the scene. Um, Actors I don't even know their names. Just like the show is mostly men, and we're all so beautiful, which just made it more fun to watch. But the plot of this show is actually what kept me coming back to this. I would not have kept tuning in. I'm all for DNFing a TV show like I am with a book, and the plot and the story is what really kept me going. So are there's kind of like four main characters. The main character though is Crosby. That he goes by his last name. I think his first name might be Anthony. I don't even know. And he is actually the narrator of the whole story. And we meet all of them as they are. So for some of them, we meet them when they're in the U.S. and about to go over to England because they were based, I think, in Anglia, where they're like the US Air Force had a base. That's where they are based. And we like meet them all as they are getting there. So they're they're new to the war. They're new in their kind of like Air Force career. So Crosby is a navigator, and it's really funny. In the first few episodes are like very mission based. So, what the US Army was doing in World War II, and I never even really realized the distinction because most of what I know about World War II, I've learned through historical fiction, which the ones that I read are typically about the women, which is what I love. And like, there are women in this show. They are not like this is really like a men's story, which like usually I like prefer learning about the women, but these guys were so brave. Like when you watch this, I was like freaking out and I was just sitting on my couch. Like they are so brave, and it was like I really enjoyed learning their story. But um I just completely lost my train of thought. Oh, so the first few episodes are really about these missions that they were taking. And this is what I didn't realize at the time. So the American Air Force was doing daytime missions, but like the Royal Air Force, the British, they were doing them at night, and doing it during the day was obviously so much more dangerous. So the casualty rates were insane, and there's one, I think it's episode 3, where literally the full hour is just them on a mission. And I was like eating dinner while I was watching it, and I had to stop eating because I was getting so anxious because they are in danger like the entire time. And like there are so many casualties. Like you get attached to these characters and these men, and you get so scared for them, and like there's no guarantee of their safety. Like they're kind of fucked up there. But so Crosby is the narrator of the whole story. I know that this is based off of a book. I'm not sure if it was based off of his memoirs or something like that. He is a navigator, and in the beginning he is like an in-flight navigator, and he gets with like air sickness, so he'd literally be like throwing up while they're being shot at and like dropping bombs, and it was so crazy. But he eventually is like grounded, and he gets promoted up through the ranks, and I really loved him. He was kind of like a funny guy, and Anthony Boyle plays him, who is kind of becoming like a new guy on the scene. He's playing John Wilkes Booth in another Apple TV show. What is it called? I don't remember what it's. Oh, The Manhunt, which I also want to watch. And I really liked him. My favorite character was Callum Turner's character because he is like my new celebrity crush. And so him and Austin Butler play best friends who knew each other in the States, and they go by Buck and Bucky, and it's so confusing. And this is when you know that it's based off of real life, because no screenwriter would have given two characters essentially the same exact name. And Callum Turner's character though is like super cocky. They're both like they're like a higher rank than most of the other guys, but they're very good at what they do. And they're kind of just like these really big characters, and like Callum Turner's character is a bit more of like, he's not a douchebag, but like he maybe leans that way. And Austin Butler's character is kind of like the nice guy who like reins him in, and they have like a really cute friendship that I just enjoyed watching, and I just like enjoyed looking at the both of them. And I think I've said this on here before. I can never keep track of like where I say things, but when I was at the Eras tour in LA, I walked right by Austin Butler, and I was just like, oh, he is so beautiful. And then there is Rosie, who comes a few episodes into the series. So there are like Crosby, Buck, and Bucky are like kind of like the main three, but people are coming in and out because people are dying and new men are getting shipped into war. So Rosie comes a few episodes in, and he is like one of the top pilots. I think the guy's name is Nate Mann, who plays him. He is so cute. Like I really liked him looking at him, but he is like one of the top pilots, and like it was just like the characters were so interesting. And I don't want to spoil, but I felt there's something to be said about reading historical fiction versus watching something like this. Before I got so into reading historical fiction, I had seen things like this. I've seen Saving Private Ryan. Like I saw Dunkirk. Like you've seen World War II media. To me, reading about it, I learn more, because instead of just showing you something, they have to describe it. And that to me like translates more into an education. But I don't know. I think maybe some things might have been confusing if I didn't already know things about the war that I did, if that makes sense. But there's a bunch of different aspects that take place then. So you see resistance fighters, you see concentration camps, you see liberation. Like it goes through to the end of the war. Like D-Day is covered, which was really cool to see, because when I went to France a few years ago, I went to Normandy and I went to the D-Day beaches, and it was just like, that was such a moving, amazing experience, specifically like as an American abroad. And it was just cool to see, like, the way this show is done so well, like you feel like you're in there. And then there are women in the story who, on the base, there's women who give them their coffee and donuts. And it reminded me of the book, The Beantown Girls, which I love. And Natasha Lester, who is one of my favorites, she has a book about, women who are pilots. And I was just like, seeing the women, they were not the main characters. Like they weren't even minor characters. They were like, there's barely any women in this show, honestly. But where they were, I was like, oh, I've read books about those women. And I like kind of enjoyed like placing. I was like I said before, like, oh, these were the Beantown Girls, this is this book. Like I just had fun doing that. I don't know if this am I making the show sound appealing. It was just, I enjoyed it so much. It takes a lot for me to watch a show and not go on my phone. That's why I like to read, because I can't go on my phone, because then I don't know what's happening in the book. I'm always on my phone when I'm watching TV, and I was not touching my phone at all when I was watching this. Like I was so sucked into it. It is so well done. This is one that you can like watch with your grandparents and aunts and uncles. I actually, like, at a family party a few weeks ago, my uncles were telling my brother that they needed to watch this, and I was like, excuse me, I'm obsessed with that show. And my uncle told me there is a documentary about all of the real guys, and at the end of the show they tell you what some of them went on to do. And one of them went on to then interrogate Goring in the Nuremberg trials, and I was like, what the heck, why did they end the show on the end of the show? I want to watch that. Like that, it was just so cool. I so enjoyed it. That was Masters of the Air. Let's get into books. The first book is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. The actual request for this was for the whole series. So I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with this series, and then I'm going to give a review of the first book, because I just reread it, and I think that is the best way to cover a series like this, especially one as long as Throne of Glass. So some of you might have already read this whole series. You know what I'm talking about. For others, this is by Sarah J. Maas, like I said, author of ACOTAR. This was her first series. She started writing this at like 15 and used to live on like a live journal type website. Okay, let me tell you about my experience with Sarah J. Maas first. So I read all of her books 5.5 years ago. I read ACOTAR first, and then I went into Throne of Glass, and then Crescent City wasn't even out yet when I read them, and then I read Crescent City. So ACOTAR was my gateway drug to Sarah J. Maas, and I would still recommend reading that one first. But I love Throne of Glass, and I know that some people struggle with it because it is different from ACOTAR. Like there is romance in it, but it doesn't feel as much of a romance. I always have described this as Game of Thrones light. Like when I was reading this for the first time, Game of Thrones was still on, and it just reminded me of that. Like you are on this epic adventure, you fall for these characters, you hate some of these characters. Like there's so many characters in this series, and I just like, I really love this one, but you have to know going into it that you are in for a long journey. Like ACOTAR, there's now like 4 main books and a novella, but like when I first read them, it was just the first 3 and the novella. And like I kind of describe it as like season 1, and then starting with the novella, and then Silver Flames is like season 2 of ACOTAR. Throne of Glass, it's a completed series. Like you are getting all of them at once. It is a commitment. Like it's way more of a commitment than the ACOTAR books. But to me, it is so worth it. It's different than ACOTAR but it's similar enough that if you really loved it and you loved like Fae and the magic and those characters, like it's by the same author, there's going to be similar things happening, then I really recommend reading this one. My recommended reading order for Sarah J. Maas is ACOTAR, Throne of Glass, and then Crescent City. But if you want to do Crescent City before Throne of Glass, I think that you can, but I just recommend doing Crescent City last. It's also the shortest one. So like I said, I read them all 5.5 years ago. And then since December of 2023, I've been on my reread journey with Sarah J. Maas. So in December, I reread all of ACOTAR, and then I reread Crescent City 1 and Crescent City 2, and then Crescent City 3 came out. And then I was like, I am rereading Throne of Glass now. So I just read the first one. I'm aiming to do one a month. I'm happy to space them out over the year. There is a new thing where there's a tandem read between Tower of Dawn and I think it's Queen of Shadows. And one of my high school friends very kindly sent me a Kindle like doc that has the two books together in the Kindle. So I am going to do the tandem read via that Kindle file for when I get up to that, but I'm assuming that won't happen until like the summer maybe. And I'm not even going to try to explain that because it's hard to, like, this is like, how many books are in the series? Let me count. There's 8 books in total, and 2 of them that were kind of like, one's like a prequel and one is like a side a side quest. But it's hard to talk about a series like that where so much happens without, like, I can't talk about the later books because you won't even know who the characters are when you first start, right? I also want to say there are different what is the word I'm looking for? There are conflicting reading orders for this series because the book Assassin's Blade is like a prequel, and it's kind of just like different short stories about the main character Selena, and that is how I say it. If that is not how you say it, whatever. I recommend, this is how I read it. I did Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, which is book 2, and then I read Assassin's Blade, and then I read Heir of Fire, which after book 3 is when the series kind of just like the world expands open, and it really, if you look at the books in the store, that's when they start getting so much bigger, and that is when like it all starts going down. I like taking myself out. When I finished reading Crown of Midnight, I was screaming. On the episode that my sister was on, I think we talked about this, but I remember it so vividly. I was in my bed in the house I grew up in, and I was flipping out over that last chapter, and my sister was downstairs in the living room flipping out over something in ACOTAR, and I remember like tweeting like, the whole house is freaking out about Sarah J. Maas. But it was so hard to not go right on to the next book, to go into Assassin's Blade. But I was so happy that I did that because things from Assassin's Blade come up as you go on in the series. And I felt like I just had a better reading experience already having known those little prequel stories. I'm not sure if I'm going to reread Assassin's Blade in my reread. I probably will, but TBD on that. So last little note before I get into like all the plot and stuff. This book I was surprised at how young it read. And maybe I did notice that when I first read them, or maybe I'm obviously 5 years older now and I didn't. But when my sister was on an episode, I was like, yeah, like Crescent City is adult, but like it reads the same as ACOTAR to me, which I still stand by. But then reading Throne of Glass and then reading Crescent City, Throne of Glass just reads so much younger, which this is not a criticism. It is just something to know going into it. Like the writing style is very different from even ACOTAR in the first book. Like I haven't reread them all yet, but like I do not think the whole series goes on like that. And you have to keep in mind that like she wrote Throne of Glass like when she was 15 years old, and that's why. But it does not take away from the experience at all. I kind of like fell in love with this first book when I just reread it, and I was remembering how I felt when I was reading it, and I was like, I had just come off of ACOTAR, which I loved so much, and I was just like, I can't imagine feeling like this about characters again. But the thing about ACOTAR is that I don't love Feyre, who is the main girl. I love Selena. Like Nesta is now my number one Sarah J. Maas girl, but like Selena is like a very, very close number two. I love her so much, and I just loved being back with her. And yeah, so what is this book about? So this takes place in a different world, obviously, where the like continent that we're in used to have magic, but this evil king kind of like conquered the continent, and because of that the magic left, and also the fae left, and they went to another continent because they were being hunted down and persecuted and in danger, and the magic just abandoned this country. So the everyone is human in this first book, and that's not a spoiler because it's Sarah J. Maas. Obviously fae are going to come to be involved. So we know that there's like this evil king who overtook everything. He lives in this giant glass castle in like the main city. I obviously don't remember the name of the city. And there is this territory in the north that he has already conquered called Terrasin, which comes to be very important. And there's also these kind of other areas though where he is waging war and trying to conquer. And there's all this talk of rebels and things like that. So our main girl is Selena, and she is the number one top assassin in this country. And when we first meet her, she's enslaved basically in this like slave camp where she is forced to work in these mines. It is absolutely brutal. She is like, people can't believe she survived as long as she did in this camp, and she is hauled out of the mines one day by this guy who is the in the King's Guard, and his name is Cole. That's how I say it. I think some people say Kale or something, but to me it's Cole. And she's like, what is going on? And they like haul her into like the main area, and she is met with the crown prince Dorian, and Dorian basically offers her this ultimatum. He was like, you can stay here and you're probably going to die here, or you can come and be my champion, because his dad, the king, is hosting this tournament where the person who wins will become the king's champion. And they basically like strike a deal where Selena agrees to go and be his champion in the tournament. And if she wins and becomes the king's champion, then she will have to serve him for 4 years, and then she is free. So it's like this or certain death. So she chooses to go. And that's kind of when it all kicks off. She arrives in the castle, and there's this tournament going on, and like I have told you guys many a time, like I don't love reading about a tournament. Like I'm not a Hunger Games girl. But this one, the way that it's written is just like so not like a tournament, because there's so many other things going on. And it's very obvious that there's more to Selena than meets the eye. There are hints that she was ripped away from her parents, and we know that she was raised by this like brutal guy who's like head of assassin network. She's the top assassin. She has like an infamous reputation, but nobody knows that she's actually who she is, because they would be shocked to learn that like such a young girl is this assassin. I think she's 17 in the first book, but she also loves books. And maybe it might be in Crown of Midnight, because I didn't see it in Throne of Glass, but I remember there was this quote pretty much saying about how like she loved like books and like fashion and beautiful things, but she was also like so strong, or like I don't know, it just really hit me the first time I read it, and I vaguely remember it still 5 years later. But she though is also sleuthing around the castle. So it's very clear she hates the king. She's uncomfortable being in this glass castle. Like, we don't know why. I don't know why, because I don't remember. And as she's like walking around though, she sees these things around like the castle called word marks. And they're basically these markings in, like, there'll be like there's like a clock tower that's like dedicated to like a god or something, and then there's word marks around it. And then people that are competing in the tournament start showing up murdered, and there are word marks around them. So she starts digging into what is going on. And then there is another main character in this first book named Nahima, and she is a princess from this country on the continent that the king is currently trying to conquer, and she's kind of there as like a thing of goodwill. And her and Selena strike up a friendship, and I really loved their friendship. And she kind of like teaches Selena about some things that Selena's looking into, and I really can't say more. I gave this 4 stars both times I read it. It's very rare for me to give the first book in a series 5 stars, because you're really just like dipping your toes in. But looking back at this series and knowing what I know now, I feel like the world building is done in a really great way, because books 1 and 2 are kind of very similar. But then, like I said, book 3 is when everything just like blows up and just the whole world expands, and you really have time to like immerse yourself in things before that happens. It was really cool while I was rereading this, like, because there's so many characters in this series that really those 4 characters, like Selena, Dorian, Cole, and Nahima, are like pretty much the only like characters of importance in the first book. Obviously the king, but like we hate him. But there comes to be so many characters in this series. And it was really interesting as I was reading this. It was like these doors or word gates were opening in my mind, and I would suddenly be like re-picture scenes that happen in like many books down the line. And I was remembering all of these characters and all these events that take place. And it was a cool like memory exercise, I guess. But I really enjoyed this reread. I'm so excited to continue it. I just loved being back with these characters, and it's interesting knowing, like, I remember how it all ends, but it was like kind of cool being back at the beginning. And it was different than when I reread ACOTAR. I remembered ACOTAR a bit more, I think, because that series is shorter. Like this one, like I said, is pretty long, but really enjoyed it. Gave it 4 stars again. That is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. The next book is Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. When this first came out, was like, okay, like didn't really pay any attention to it. But my aunt read this with her book club, and she was like, you have to read this book. So I picked it up and I loved it so much. So thank you to my Aunt Janine. One thing I will say though, she did this on audio, and then she went to her book club and everyone was like, oh my God, the pictures in the book. And she had no idea what they were talking about. So I highly recommend doing this as a physical book. And I will explain why in a minute. But this, I guess, can be classed as horror. It's kind of like a spooky thriller. There are a lot of supernatural elements at play. It is such a page turn. Like, I could not put this down. Our main girl is Mallory, and when we meet her, she has just gotten out of rehab. She was living in a halfway house, and her sponsor helped her find this job as a nanny for this couple, Ted and Caroline, and she's looking after their 5-year-old son, Teddy. And at first, it's like everything is going great. She has her own like little cottage in the back where she lives, and it's like the first time she kind of has her own place, and she finally has stability in her life, and she's like really getting her life on the right track. And she likes to go for runs, and her and Teddy are growing closer and closer, and he's obsessed with drawing in his sketchbook. So it's like usually just normal kid stuff, but one day he draws a man dragging a woman's lifeless body, and Mallory is rightfully very freaked out, but she's kind of like, okay, he's a little kid, like kids have crazy imaginations. But more and more things keep happening. His drawings keep getting like creepier and creepier. Weird things like start happening around the house, and this is why I recommend getting the physical book, because the actual book has the drawings in it. So that is part of why it got so creepy, because you're not just reading the description, like you're seeing these disturbing images that this kid drew. So Mallory is like, what the heck is going on here? She like loves this job. She doesn't want to lose it. And she's like concerned, and she's concerned for the kid. So she starts like looking into this long ago cold case that happened in the area, and the cottage she's living in is tied into things. And that is kind of how it all opens up. It is a thriller, so I obviously can't say too much, but she, there's a love interest, and he's from like this wealthy family in town, and he helps her look into things. And she is like feeling like she's going crazy because she's like, there's no way like this kid is like being possessed and drawing these things. And she's like, what is going on here? And there's like a lot of stuff with Teddy's parents, and like that is like the shortest review ever. I'm sorry, but this book is so good. If you are looking for something that will keep you up reading all night and then maybe keep you up all night because it's creepy, I highly recommend this. I would kind of class this in the same category as something like The September House, where like there's supernatural things, it's super spooky, but it's not straight scary. It's just very eerie. And this one becomes so vivid because you can actually see the drawings. It's very atmospheric. Like I remember she's like, she lives in this cottage in the back, and she like kind of gets scared to be alone at night. And then I was like, oh my God, maybe I'm scared to be alone, even though I have roommates. But it is just so, so good. I think about this book all the time. I gave it 4 stars. That is Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. The final request was for an NYC book, and I saw on the Instagram comment that a few people had liked that comment. So I was like, okay, I should do this. But it also gave me a really great idea. So stay tuned. I'm going to start kind of like a monthly series just for 3 months where I'm going to do episodes centered around my favorite cities. So the first one will be New York, then I'll do London, and then I'll do Paris, and I will cover 3 books that take place in that city. And then I'll, in the beginning, kind of talk about my experiences in the city, maybe the New York one. I can do like my coming to New York story. I can talk about my London trip. I can talk about, like my Paris trip on the other one. So I'm very excited to do that because books are the best way to travel. Lately I've just been like itching to travel and plan a trip, but I'm trying to save money, so I'm not doing that. And the best way to transport yourself somewhere else is through a book. But there's so many books I could have chosen for a New York City book. And at first I didn't really want to do historical fiction, but when I think about New York books, I think about Fiona Davis. So each of her books take place in New York, and they are all centered around a different New York landmark. So there's the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, there's the Chelsea Hotel, and this book I'm going to talk about today is about Radio City Music Hall, one of my favorite buildings in New York. So this is The Spectacular by Fiona Davis. Radio City, like I just said, is one of my favorite buildings in New York. There are some buildings where you just walk in here and you feel the history. And, I'm very privileged getting to live in New York because you get to go to so many iconic places. And I love when I see someone perform at Madison. First of all, I love Madison Square Garden. Like I love MSG. I love going to shows there. I love going to hockey games there. And I love seeing an artist perform at MSG because it is such a monumental moment in their career. And I think there's something very special about getting to be in that room. But there's also something so special about like, that's my local venue, and I feel the same way about Radio City. Like when artists have a show at Radio City, it's a big deal for them. Like I remember seeing Harry Styles there, and like that was a huge deal. It was right after One Direction, and he was playing Radio City, and it was like, wow. And like, hi, Maggie Rogers. Just like, Lord, I've been to so many shows there, and I don't want to like humble brag to you guys all day, but it's when you walk in there, you feel the magic and the specialness at Radio City more so than the Garden, because Radio City is like beautiful inside. It is Art Deco interior. You feel like you step back in time. And I think that's why it's so cool to go to concerts there, because you can just imagine all the different types of events that have taken place in that room through history in New York. And I just love it. It's beautiful. I love the outside. I love the marquee. I love that it still looks old timey. I've seen the Christmas show, I think only twice in my whole life. So this is about being about Radio City. It is obviously about the Rockettes. I think like any child, I was infatuated with the Rockettes when I was little. A girl well, she was a woman who lived in my neighborhood when I was growing up, was a Rockette, and that was very cool. So when I heard about this is her Fiona Davis's latest release that came out last year, and when I heard it was Radio City and the Rockettes, I was like, oh my God, like that is so good. I am so into this. So this book takes place in 1956. And our main girl is Marion, and she's from a very conservative family, basically meaning that her dad thinks that women should be married, or if they have to work, they should be a secretary, nurse, or teacher. Like that, he is so rigid in that it is infuriating to read. But she has very big dreams. She is a dancer and she always wanted to be a rockette. So as we meet her, she goes to an audition and she gets the part, and all of her dreams come true. But her dad was very against that. So there's a lot of family drama in this. You know, she had a boyfriend who was kind of on like the same page as her dad. So she is kind of like leaves her family behind. I think she lived in Connecticut to move to New York City, where she moves into the real building where like Rockettes and models lived, and she meets like roommates and she makes friends. And I loved everything about the Rockettes in this. You follow her from audition to rehearsals to all of the shows. Like the Christmas Spectacular is part of this, and you see the girls like camaraderie and how they become such close friends. And there's something to be said about learning about what these women go through back then and still to this day to be kind of this like idealized version of a woman. Like the Rockettes are like world famous, and it was just very cool to get to be behind the scenes in that. And it was cool because Fiona Davis interviewed a ton of Rockettes from throughout time for this book. And when it came out, I went to an event to hear her speak about it. And there were Rockettes in the crowd who, like, these women were in their like 70s and 80s, and they were Rockettes like back in the day. And it was just so cool and like special to see them there. But as I said, there's a ton of family drama as she's dealing with becoming a Rockette. Plus, there's this guy around town called the Big Apple Bomber, and this is a real thing. A guy was planting bombs all over New York City for 16 years at major sites. And I had never heard about this, but this is a true story, and a bomb did go off at Radio City, and that is what inspired the book when Fiona Davis learned about that. And she kind of gets tangled up in the case. So it becomes kind of like a murder mystery from there. She's trying to find the Big Apple Bomber because she is like a kind of like secondhand victim to the bombing at Radio City. I'm trying to say it without spoilers, obviously. So I love this because there's so many interesting things going on here. Like already, it's 1950s in New York City. That's interesting to read about. We have the Rockettes. There's crazy family drama, which you guys know I always love to read about. And then there's this like mystery element, but it all worked in a way that it was like, this easily could have been someone's real life, like it didn't seem like anything was outlandish to be included. I really, really enjoyed this. The day that I read it, my internet went out. So I literally could not do anything but read. And I just which is fine for me. But there's something about like reading all day by choice versus reading all day because you have nothing else to do, like because you literally can't do anything else. But I was so excited that I had this one to pick up and read. I just really, really enjoyed this. I love all of Fiona Davis's books. I always recommend them. They are a great entryway into historical fiction. It's a great way to learn more about New York. There's always a bit of a mystery element. They usually are dual timeline, except this one is not. The dual timeline ones are cool because you'll get to see the same landmark in two different timelines. Her next book is about the Met, and it takes place in the 70s, and it's about kind of like the first days of the Met Gala, and I'm very excited for that. But I'm a huge fan of Fiona's. I loved this book. I love Radio City. Nothing is more New York City than Radio City, That was The Spectacular by Fiona Davis, and I can't remember if I said this, but I gave it 4 stars. All right, time for some mood reads. The first one comes from Bitches Be Bookin', which honestly, this whole episode is for her because 2 of the books I talked about were her request and the opening segment. So this episode is dedicated to her. She's in the mood for something light, quick, and fun to read. And I would say The Cuban Heiress by Chanel Clayton. I'm a huge fan of Chanel Clayton's historical fiction. This one is kind of like a heist at sea. It's a fun read. I really enjoyed that book. Next comes from Melissa, and she's in the mood to read something that's set in New Zealand. And I have been racking my brain. I even Googled New Zealand books to see if I had read any of them, and I hadn't. And two, I was like, I haven't read anything set in New Zealand except there's this book called Call Me Evie by J.P. Palmore. And it's a thriller, and it's about a girl who's been kidnapped. And when he was keeping her in captivity, because the big chunk of the book takes place in Australia, but he was keeping her in captivity in New Zealand. So that's the only New Zealand book I've read. So that's my recommendation for that. And finally, Jillian is in the mood for Shakespeare retelling. I actually also to memory have not read any, but on my shelf is Fair Rosalind by Natasha Solomon, which looks really good, and I'm planning on reading. That is our show. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure you're following, subscribe, whatever sits you on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. Leave a rating and review. It will make my day. Follow me on Instagram at @KaraWhat. Follow the show at Professional Book Girl. Quickly read the book club pick by Thursday. It's Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. Submit your thoughts to me right now if you would like to be included in the episode. And I think that is all. Happy reading. I will see you on Thursday.